Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is KaNisa Williams, also known as Darling Nisi, and I am your moderator today for the ladies panel. So, housekeeping. If you have a question that comes up, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Leave your question in there to make sure that we see it and we can address it as we go along in our 90 minutes today. So, I always send like a million questions whenever I have people on a panel or a podcast, and we have a lot to get through today. So, we're going to do introductions. And the way we're going to do introductions is we're going to combine that with my first question, which is what were your initial thoughts when you first heard Come? How did it compare to your expectations, especially considering Prince's previous work? And we'll start with Violet.
How did I know I would be? Okay, so on intro, I'm Violet Brown. I am an attorney first. That's what I do for a living, but I'm also a musician. My first impression for me, because of course it's really musically where I go, right? And you have Love Symbol album, which is still jazzy, same band members. So to me, that kind of funky jazz thing that the power trio has, that's what I got out of it right away. Some of the lyrics and stuff, you know, I when I first heard it, I was a teenager, and yeah, so there's that. And that's all I'll say for now. And I'll pass it on. I don't know if you wanted us to choose people or
You can pass it on.
so I'll go to where is Miss Beautiful Hair? I where did it Mila.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Mila Asha. I am, I guess, like on the younger side of the Prince fandom. Started listening around like 2010, 2009-ish or so. And I tap in every week, every Saturday with D'Angelo and Michael Dean for their What Did Prince Do? That's fun. And my first impression of the Come album, I too was also very young when I heard this album. So I honestly didn't even know what to think of it. I sat in silence for about 20 good minutes to collect my thoughts. And then yeah, I guess we'll dive into that a bit later. But yeah, that's me.
Okay. How about you, Aisha?
I'm Aisha K. Staggers. I am the co-host of Primetime Saturday with Aisha and Lala, and the new Girlfriends Chat with Lala and Jill Jones. We recorded our first episode this week. Um, I struggled with that question to figure out what my first impression was, because for some reason 1994 is such a blur to me. I just remember buying it and buying the cassette and that experience, and that was a fun experience. So
Okay. Rhonda?
Hey, good morning, everybody. I'm Rhonda Nicole. I'm a singer and a songwriter and a lot of other things, but mostly that. So I've been thinking about that question as well. And Aisha and I earlier this week were kind of talking about, does anybody remember 93, 94? Like, what happened? It's a blur for some of us. So for me, I do absolutely remember buying the Come CD. It came out right as my sophomore year of college was starting. I was 19, was moving into the dorm, starting my semester as a resident assistant. So a lot of movement. I just become an AKA. There was a lot that was happening. But I distinctly remember that a lot of my friends on campus at the time were really excited about everything that was happening in the Prince world at that time. So Come, 1-800-NEW-FUNK, the new websites that were popping up. I mean, there was a lot, again, there was a lot of activity that was kind of happening all around that same time. As far as my initial thoughts, I would be lying if I said that I remember listening to it the first time and I remember what I thought. But I've never not liked a Prince album. So I definitely liked it. I think that at that time, I had been so enamored with the Love Symbol album. I definitely, I do remember interpreting it as a very different listening experience, but I wasn't sitting with it in any kind of real critical space. So that's where I was at that time in 1994.
Okay. To close this out on the introduction question, Miss Chinisha, What's your first impression here?
Hi, everyone. It's Chinisha. And introduction wise, a multi hyphenate. I work in television and production primarily, but I am everywhere and nowhere as far as the Prince album is concerned. I mean, I also listened to it for the first time when I was about 18, but it was not in 1993. So when I first listened to the album, I was kind of like collecting all the past works and kind of getting caught up. And by the time I found Come, it was one of the first albums that I purchased with my own money and was listening to. And I think that having heard a lot of the early works and then immediately jumping into Come in a way that other folks probably hadn't, they, in real time were listening to it years apart. For me, it was, Around the World in the Day, Come. And so there was this huge juxtaposition between like what I'm listening to and the differences of it. And so my first reaction was like, I had the benefit of hindsight and listening to it. I was like, wow, this is really an album of its time. That's really interesting. But also falling in love with it because Come is one of my favorite albums. It's an underrated cut and it's one of my favorite Prince albums. So I guess we'll chat more about that down the road.
We will. And before we get deeper into the album, I really want to talk about the visual component around this time, especially with the cover of the album. So, how does the album's cover and visual presentation influence your perception of the music? And do you think it effectively represents the themes on the album? And I'm looking around at the faces of people who are ready to respond, so y'all can jump in there.
I mean, if you don't mind, I don't mind jumping in. I actually was just, re-looking at the album today just to refresh my memory. And one of the things that really stood out to me about this album in comparison to prior albums is like the kind of the maturity that he's reflecting here in the songwriting, but specifically the dates, his birth year and the current year. And it really, to me, it talked about like a self-reflexiveness, but also maybe a bit of an insecurity. He was going through a time where like it's almost like a metaphoric death of sorts that he's walking into the next chapter of his career. And also just like the super low angle shot of him trying to be 6 foot tall. It's giving a guy standing in front of what appears to be a cemetery who's really like thinking about the gateway to the next stage kind of musically though. But it doesn't look like that when you first look at the album.
It's very dark, right? The imagery is very dark, and you realize he's at this dark moment in his life, career-wise, not just from not just his work, but the way that he was seeing people perceive him. People in the mainstream weren't responding to the way they had in years past, particularly 1991 and 92. And then what he was dealing with Warner Brothers. So there's this dark element that kind of hangs over it, but you also hear it in the music and in the keys that he writes things in. So the darkness kind of follows through and you're waiting to the light point. And so I think that's what I get from it, that there's a dark heaviness about it, but there's also something very light and existential about it at the same time.
I think for me, one of the things that stands out about the album artwork is that although we've seen Prince play with black and white before with Parade, it's vastly different. To your point, Aisha, it's dark, it's foreboding. There is, in my interpretation of the artwork, and I've been looking at it a lot more recently in preparation for today, it feels very isolated, especially when I think about the imagery and the visuals that we had during the Parade era. Yes, it's black and white. Yes, there's a whole movie that's in black and white, but there's a vibrancy behind the scenes that you absolutely know is there. With Come, it's very like we're shutting it all down. This is it. And for sure, and correct me if I've got my memories wrong, but I do recall at the end of the 3 Chains of Gold set where they're burying Prince. And so that, because I'd seen that, it set me up for what to expect visually or to kind of understand what was being communicated with the album art. But it's not, if you were to ask me what some of my favorite Prince album art is, it ain't this, not because it's not lovely, but just because it really kind of feels like it's a very suppressed and trapped type of visual aesthetic.
I'll go next, and I agree with what Rhonda was saying about that trapped. Colors, if you notice, with everything he did, colors were always a big part of the theme, right? And I love what you said about the difference between the black and white in the parade era and this, because there was a lightness to that, right? With this, it does feel very heavy. And to KaNisa's point about it matching the artwork, matching the music, you think about Solo, you think about Dark, like some of those lyrics, I think it absolutely matches. It's not my favorite cover either. And actually that entire style with the whole so much cover up, like he's so covered up and he's usually so sexy and just the energy definitely is something other than happy, sexy musician, if you will. That's the way I would say that.
Yeah, I guess like following up with what everyone else was saying of the whole dark theme on it. I remember when I first saw it, it was kind of like it wasn't catching my eye because it was so dark. So then later on when I found out like, oh, this was supposed to be like a throwaway album, I was like, well, I can see that because it doesn't stand out. But then as I guess it was kind of like getting older, I actually kind of felt more drawn to that cover just because of the whole, I guess my own personal style was starting to turn into like a alternative kind of goth-ish, being in that realm. So then looking at it, I was just like, oh yeah, this album cover is like the shit. I just loved it after that. But I also, like everyone else, thought that it was a cemetery. And then later on finding out that it's a church. And then I guess like when I started going through the whole album, I was just like, okay, like I guess it makes sense. Cause then I just started putting it as like, okay, well, it's a church, and at the churches, like you have all these different I guess experiences of like all this different change, because that's what I was getting from the album. I was like, all right, he's going through some change in his life. I didn't know the full backstory of the album when I first listened to it, but I just could kind of get that sense, especially at the end when she gets to like let it go. But I was just like, oh, okay, yeah, like he's stepping into the church. It's like a reborn type of thing. But I was like, oh, still spooky though. So but I just thought like, okay, this is one of his like duality things that's obviously just like a theme in his music. So at the time also when I started listening, similar to Chinisha, like I was just bopping around and I wasn't even going through like, all right, I listened to this whole album. All right, I'm move on to the next one. I was like picking and choosing singles through like different albums, like not in order at all. So I think I maybe like went from an early thousands like couple of songs and then jumped back to like early 90s. So I was all over the place. So I didn't have too much of a preconceived idea of like what to expect. It was just like, all right, this is just what it is and I'll take him as it is.
Yeah, it's interesting hearing you guys talk. I keep thinking about Janelle Monáe and how when she first started, or when they first started, it was like a suit, right? And it was like, I need you to take me seriously in the art that I'm portraying here. And similarly, Prince had that same thing going on to be like the cover of the album. I am in a suit. I'm looking at you seriously. I'm looking right at the camera, and you need to like pay attention to what's going on because this is serious business. So, to that point, kind of moving into the musical and lyrical exploration of this album, it, it this album explores themes of sexuality, identity, and morality or mortality. What lyric stood out to you most, and why? And how do these themes resonate in today's cultural landscape? And I will go to Rhonda first.
That's a great question. I think the lyrics that have always stood out the most for me, and I think this has come up over the last day or so, Solo, which of course is interesting because it's not a song that Prince wrote. There's another writer. But the sound mixed with the lyrics, it's just one of the most haunting and isolating feeling songs. And I feel like, Prince is really good at conveying a lot of different emotions and feelings through his music. Obviously, we all know this. And he had a very interesting way of conveying loss and loneliness and separateness. And this song is one that I've always felt stands out, specifically when he says the curb looks like a skyscraper. Like you are so outside of yourself at that point that the things that are clearly much smaller than you physically feel as though they are an insurmountable building or mountain. And so I think for me, certainly that lyric has always just really kind of punched me in the gut. And then on a slightly lighter side, just the entire song Come, because I've always, initially hearing it, I interpret it as a very on the nose, literal expression of sex. And of course, can I suck you, baby? Can I, you, baby? That always just makes, see, you're laughing. That makes me giggle because I'm just like, what? Like, do we say these things in the midst of the moment? And yes, but I think that those two songs have always really stood out to me lyrically, solo, because just of the depth of the hurt that is exposed and explored in that song. And then Come, because it is a bit of levity and funk and rebelliousness that comes through those lyrics as well.
Okay, how about you, Chinisha?
It's really interesting hearing you talk about that, Rhonda, because for me, I felt like this album was so much more self-reflexive and less explicitly about the world. So I think it's like finding meaning and how it resonates, which is really interesting. Because if you look at something like, Ronnie Talked to Russia, which is very explicitly like making commentary about the world, and this one, I think that it's more open to interpretation, but I think a lot of it is him thinking about himself. And again, going back to the cover, like it is him thinking about where I am right now in the world. And Rodney dropped in the chat the line, "Don't abuse children or else they turn out like me." And for me, Papa is probably one of the most difficult songs on the album to listen to because I have a really bad relationship with my father, and which oftentimes mirrored a lot of what Prince alluded to in his music about his relationship. And so that song felt really difficult, but that line always kind of made me feel a little bit encouraged because maybe if I get my ass whooped enough, I'll turn out like Prince. Not the kind of takeaway you want, but that's like the one redeeming factor, right? So for me, the song, just the album itself is about thinking about where we are in the world, and like even this, for me, when I listened to it, even a lot of the lyrics resonated with me. Let It Go was very much, I felt like a reflection. All my life, I kept my feelings deep inside. I think that for me, it was very much an album that reflected where I was, but at the time that I listened to it. And I felt like it was him thinking about that as well. So it's really interesting to look at him thinking about his place while looking at himself.
Okay, Aisha?
Actually, I was going to say the exact same two songs for two of the same reasons. Particularly with Let It Go, as someone who struggles with anxiety, I could feel every bit of anxiety he had in every song on this album. And knowing the circumstances behind it, that the chorus of that song is really kind of like a mantra. When you struggle with anxiety, you're always telling yourself, I've got to let this go so I can function. And at that time, I actually just remembered from your first question, at that time, I was dealing with a lot of anxiety. College, in college, things were changing and it was just a confusing time in my life and a really bad relationship. And that song was kind of like the theme of all the songs I was listening to, or things to kind of like just release this negative energy that you've been feeling. And I get that from that song, that's kind of where he was in his life, this period of trying to release this negative energy, which, kind of makes sense that the last song is Orgasm, the release of some kind of energy at the end of the album. But that struggle with anxiety throughout the lyrics of the song. And when you go back to Papa, the song is just full of a child that's a little ball of anxious energy. And it kind of bleeds into all the other songs.
Okay, what do you think, Mila?
Um, Honestly, it's the same thing as everyone else of like that song of Papa, because that's actually the song that overall turned me into going, whoa, I don't know what to think about this album. Because again, I was, I don't know, maybe like sophomore, junior year of high school. And the first three songs, it's like, they have like pretty much the same sounds, very kind of like same topic going on. And then it slows down once you get to Papa, and it's just like, oh, okay. And he's painting the story. But yeah, once he says, don't abuse children or else they'll end up like me, I literally went, whoa. And I took my headphones off for a second. I was like, oh, I didn't think you'd say that. And then I also was just kind of, again, I was still very much learning about him. So I was like, it's like, are these things true? Did this happen to him? Is this a one for one like breakdown that he's saying of like what happened in his life? And when you sent over the questions and I really started thinking about it, I was just like, yeah, like it's kind of weird when I was that age, and my other reaction was kind of this protectiveness of him. Because then, since I didn't know if these were like actual events that happened to him, but I also couldn't tell if this was him maybe just speaking of someone else's perspective or if this was his own truth of what he feels about himself. It was just sort of like, oh, like I hope you really don't feel that way about yourself. And yeah, I don't know, just kind of got these protective feelings over him that at that time I didn't really know how to break that down or what to do with them. But I think looking back on it, then after finishing the album, it was an album that I felt like was pushing me because also at the time, whenever I listened to an album, it was usually only dealing with the same, like one general theme. It'd be like, all right, these are all love songs about how glad I am to be in a relationship, all love songs about getting it on or something. And this was the first album where I went like, I mean, there's duality to it, but if you just take the lyrics like on their head, it's just sort of like, oh yeah, sexy time, da da da, and then child abuse, and then race issues. And it's like, whoa, who puts that in the middle of an album? Like that's what I was thinking at the time. But yeah, that song with race was one that just it sat with me, and I was trying to sort through the feelings that I had, which I feel like even to this day I'm still trying to figure out like what is this feeling that is coming up. And I guess that's just my own journey. But then I guess the other lyrics that just kind of really stood out to me was obviously just like all of pheromone, because that was a wild lyrics.
There's definitely a lot going on in pheromone. Violet, what are your thoughts?
I definitely agree with everybody. There's so many lyrics that stand out. I am the weirdo in the group, clearly, because I'm like strawberry, chocolate, jazz. That's where I go. I'm thinking about come, like I think about music on double entendres and stuff. I love stuff like that. Um, One thing I will say is it's interesting because it is called Coming. There's a song called Orgasm, and there's all these things, but it doesn't feel as sensual as most of his music that tends to be sexual is. And it may be because the mixture of things like child abuse and loneliness. And honestly, like in solo, to me, it sounds like a person at kind of the end and kind of giving up. And so my name is no one. Like that's and then in Papa, what I love that song. When he gets to there's always a rainbow at the end of every rain, and we're all a little bit crazy. And like all of that stuff really to me resonated. But I know, like I said, I'm a little different. I tend to process emotions differently than the average person, so it probably sounds kind of strange. Trying to think of other lyrics that I like. Dark is one of my favorite songs. Um, Trying to think, Lost in the Shadow of Pain. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great lyrics, but the first thing that comes to my mind, sorry, it's come and it's still because I hear Fender Jazz. What? What? That's how my mind works. So.
No, that's real. It's interesting that I don't know, maybe because I'm being self-reflective in other parts of my life right now, but I always found Come to be more intimate than it seems, right? It's not in your face, or he's usually more sensual, but like for me, at the base of sensuality or eroticism, there's really deep like insecurity things there. Like, how do you create safety for your partners, for yourself? And then how do you open yourself up to intimacy? And it is things like thinking about how I am lonely sometimes. It is like how I struggle sometimes. And being able to reconcile that so that you can get to the good orgasm in the end, because it's all about being safe and feeling safe with yourself and your partner. But my thoughts. But going back to you, Miss Violet, because you are a musician, I wanted to ask, for the folks who are more musically oriented, what do you think about the musical elements that show up on Come, and does it stand out to you in the style of how he's doing music for this album versus the ones before or after it?
Well, and I kind of alluded to it earlier because you have Sonny T and you have Michael Bland, and the three of them together, it is a very particular sound. They have, like I said, power trio. You always feel a lot of, I'm just gonna say testosterone. That's how it feels like in the actual music. The energy is very, it's very masculine, and it stands out to me because sometimes Prince does do that thing where there's some androgyny and there is some feminine aspect, and I feel like the music that he did with that particular version of the New Power Generation, it just had a certain jazz funk maleness, male energy, plenty of anger. I always feel that way. And I notice that I tend to listen to it when I'm in a certain mood. So if I'm kind of like lashing out at the world, as a person, a woman of color in corporate America, right? That's the stuff I go to to listen to. It's in a certain space. I feel like that's my opinion.
Okay, I'm gonna hop over to you next, Miss Rhonda.
I love the music on this album. I would be lying if I said I didn't love the music on every Prince album, but this album stands out starting with the opening track. The arrangement on that song is just insane. And it felt, as much as it feels very different from, Diamonds and Pearls and from Love Symbol, it also felt very fresh. The way that the horns come through on that song is just mind blowing. And to this day, it's a song that I really enjoy listening to for that reason. And then we get to Dark, which I also find to be just beautifully orchestrated. I think the music on this album definitely is pointing in a different direction. And I think it's also a continuing conversation where Prince is reminding us, I don't need the revolution. I know y'all are kind of still hanging on to this. I've been thinking a lot in the last couple of days about the positioning of this album 10 years after Purple Rain. And I don't know if Prince intentionally was having this conversation with others or with himself, that I'm making a very definitive statement about the direction my music is able to go without that band that everybody is clinging to. I've moved on repeatedly, and I just want to reassert that. So for me, again, musically, this album is incredibly ambitious. I think it's beautifully done, despite the dark, the anger, all of that. You can still find just the beauty and the craftsmanship in this record.
Okay, Chinisha.
Yeah, absolutely. And Rhonda, to your point, there's also a hopefulness too, right? And I think, both Violet and Rhonda are pointing at like the transition to the next era in his music making. And I think that for me, this also is one of those albums that feels more of its time than other albums that preceded it. Like a lot of the time when we're listening to a Prince album, it is obviously using technology from that era, but it has its own kind of unique musical sonic universe where Come exists very, very explicitly in 1993, 1994 when you listen to it, especially Space. I think Space for me is the most like R&B early 90s kind of boppy pop funk hit, and even more so the remixes when you're listening to it. But like all of that has that undertone. Like some of the chord progressions just feel like major pop songs that you hear on the radio. It's got like a Tom's Diner feel almost on Space, but like a boppy funk version of it his own way. So like I just think that when you're moving into this era of Prince, he's making a very explicit decision to like still be quirky and weird and pushing the boundaries of his songwriting. But I think he's also to your point, moving away from the revolution's not going to tie me down because I have so much in me. But in doing that, I think he ran away for some of the things that made him so iconic. And I think in doing that, he was looking for a sound to separate himself from that. And in that kind of fell more into being influenced by the time as opposed to kind of setting the time's sound, if that makes sense.
Okay, Aisha.
It's so funny that you said that because that is exactly what I was trying to figure out. Tom Steiner. I couldn't remember the song for the life of me. I'm like, this sounds like something that played on Club MTV back in the day, some kind of British techno pop club kind of song. But to Rhonda's point from the very first question, when she said that I posed a question about not knowing what was going on in '94, I think for me, the reason I asked the question was because I was trying to figure out the musical part of it, because songs were running together. And I was considering some of the questions that would be asked for this panel session. And a lot of the songs on this album are exactly of 1994. They sit right in that space. He's got elements of New Jack Swing in there with Let It Go. Come itself is very kind of adult contemporary R&B. And that quintessential R&B ballad of the time that at the time was very dark. If you compare it to even songs by Jodeci and things like that, that just have those dark elements, those naughty bedroom elements to them. So this album, unlike many of his others, it fits in 1994. And I'm continuously asking myself the question, if that's the case, why didn't Warner Brothers take this and run with it in terms of the promotion? Because it fits right with all the music that was going on at the time. So that's a question that I wish I could have somebody explain to me, because it's kind of like, it doesn't make sense that you actually had something here that could have been very profitable had you put the money behind it to promote it, because it had all the elements that you've been asking him for all these years and he rebelled against. Well, he did it. He kind of fell in line here in his own way. But then, they just kind of let it go, literally let it go.
Okay, Mila.
Musically, I think this album is just amazing. I feel like when you're trying to dance to it, or as a dancer, I feel like this is just like a musical candy because there's just so much to play around with. I mean, this music always has these layers to it, but I don't know, there's something about come, especially for songs like Solo, and I would say Space, that there is this how do I explain it? There is like literally a space that is created in the music for you to fill in with your movements. Does that make sense? So that's why, like, when he brought in, these dancers to do like Ulysses and stuff, I was like, this is perfect. Just because, like I said, there's a lot of layers to play around here in a story to obviously go off of as well. But there's just especially Solo. I think Solo, even though there's not, I guess, technically a lot of music going on. Sorry, I'm really bad at like explaining using these definitions. I am no musician. I try my best, but I know like Solo, there's not like a whole lot of like actual music going on, but his voice is the music in that song. So that's why it's so like that was another big standout one to me, other than Papa like lyrically. Solo musically, even though there's a lack of music coming through, really stood out just because it's his voice as well. And I feel like he doesn't have too many songs where he just allows his voice to be that. Don't really hear him being mentioned like, oh yeah, Prince the singer, like too much. So that was one that I just really enjoyed. But yeah, musically overall, this album just has a lot to play with for movement.
Okay, and I'm going to come back and ask you about something you did a little bit later. But staying with music, this album features significant instrumental sections. How do these pieces contribute to the album's narrative? And do they enhance or detract from the listening experience to you or for you? So we'll start with Chinisha now.
Hi, sorry. I always takes like 3 seconds for me to get to the unmute button. Sorry. um, yeah, I think that I don't know. Maybe to my earlier question, and this is me thinking about it in this moment. I think that those larger instrumental sections also kind of lend to this feeling of introspection that I was thinking about earlier, where he's not telling you anything. He doesn't have to tell you with words what is happening. He's letting you feel the things that he's feeling, and it's more of like an emotional experience, which is not new to a Prince song, but I think the way in which he uses this, I think all the illusions that we're talking about, the space in between the notes, the space in between, this lyric and that lyric, the space in between, that album and this album. I think we're thinking about all of these transitions, and even the musical interludes as transitions are something to be said. I would be remiss if we didn't mention, because we did talk about the album cover earlier too, is that on, if I'm not bugging, in the cover on the liner notes, he also has written in like this offset text of like, do not buy the Black Album, where I think that he's also using this album as a transition from that sound that he created. Like, oh, I'm bugging, I messed up. So I think that there's a lot of that thought of like trying to redeem himself with the work. And so I think some of that, the instrumental sections on here are a way of like reminding you of who he is musically. Like, it's not just me and the band. It's like, I am the artist.
I love that. Okay, Rhonda.
My first thought about the musical expansion and exploration on this album is, again, that Prince is continuing a conversation, because there's been that stifling. There's been, and I think some folks might have talked about this yesterday, where because of the structure of the record business and how things have to be packaged and arranged, the songs can't be super long. The songs can't go on. So yes, we get remixes, we get 12 inches and all of that in previous iterations of his work. But here he's kind of like, just let it spread out, like lay back in it, get into it, and let that story complete itself before you go on to the next song. We're not just going to naturally fade out at like the 3-minute mark. And I, again, thinking about the opening / title track and how you just got this gorgeous moment that just keeps going with the horns and the movements and the changes that are happening. It really seems like he's, again, just having this conversation where he's like, I've got this beautiful arrangement, I've got these brilliant artists, and I'm just going to let them, cook for a second, and we're just going to be here and vibe. Like, it always feels like, there's pictures of him where he's got his hand in his pocket and he's just kind of in it. That is what I feel when I listen to this album. And, same thing with Dark. I know that there's probably even longer versions of these songs someplace stashed away in some case, but it just really feels like he was like, I can, so I'm going to let this go for a while and just let people be in that groove, and thinking especially about what was happening musically and culturally in 94. It feels very of that moment. Like, we kind of have this jam where we're just kind of vibing and everything is kind of cool and easy. And that's what the music feels like to me, especially those expanded and extended musical interludes within these particular songs.
Okay, Aisha.
I kind of look at it in retrospect, and I think that in a way, by including these long instrumental pieces, he's kind of sharing with us what the future of music is going to look like, where kids nowadays do not know what an instrumental break is in a song, because not one song you hear in popular music has an instrumental break of any kind. It's kind of like they need the constant stimulation of words and vocals and, rhyming and singing. And he's kind of like, oh, you better take this while you've got it. I'm putting this out there, and you can just kind of sit with the music and just let it sink in and hear every instrument that there is, and you get to identify the instruments, and you don't have that now. And so I kind of look at it with a longing and the missing of the actual of songs of that length and that composure, because he was really a man of his time, the music he grew up on, because James Brown would do like 12-minute long songs. My father made me sit and listen to all of them. I mean, and they would just go on and on and on, and sometimes in the same key. But Prince would switch up and put all these different elements in just an instrumental piece. You get to hear all of his influences. You get to hear the jazz. You get to hear the bebop. You get to hear even the hip hop influences that he did start to pull in, and you get to hear the alternative and the rock influences. And so you get to kind of contemplate what's going on in his mind musically with those pieces. And it's kind of sad that you don't get that in today's music.
Okay, what do you think, Mila?
I think this, I guess, kind of blends in with what I was saying earlier, that since there are these longer instrumental breaks, it just gives more to play with when you are trying to either like make a piece to the song. Even the poems, sometimes I think it's funny when he throws in these like the sound effects. 'Cause sometimes on other albums, I guess he can kind of overdo it, but I think he did it very perfectly on this one. But yeah, so just sort of like the longer breaks in. As someone who usually, when I relate to music, it is literally how does this make me move, and just because breaking down, I guess the technical aspect of it's not really my strong suit. So it gets me moving. So like it's doing its job, and I love that it's there.
Okay. I see someone put in a comment, Miss Taylor. She says, now that I think about it, Come, the song is kind of a preview of what we're going to get later in his career, like One Night Alone. And I had to just call that out, as, especially around the Rainbow Children, because y'all know that's my thing. All right, Miss Violet.
I agree with what everyone said. I really like what Aisha was talking about with that. The instrumentation that you don't get in current music is ever so true. So when I'm listening, now this is just me, I'm listening to hear what Sonny's doing. Like that's the way that my mind works. And in Come, when they get to about the 9 minute, it's like 9 minutes, 13 seconds, somewhere in there, and there's that change, you have horns and just one note. Sonny's just playing one note, and then it changes. Basically, it becomes a new song. I love when he does that. And you were talking about One Night Alone. It also reminds me of News. West is my favorite song on that album, even though they're all kind of like that, where you start off over here and then you're in a different song and then you're in another different song, and you can just sit there and there aren't even lyrics, but you're just really in the music. I love that about that. And I think this is a great album for that. And then I cannot remember who said it, but we were talking about solo, and it might be, I know your name is Mila, but you'll always be Miss Beautiful Hair to me. Just talking about solo with, so there are chords in there at certain points. And so his voice is going up and it's going down. And then you have those chords that come in, and it feels like an emotion. It's not just music, it feels, which is why I listen to it at certain times in life. But yeah, I think that the instrumental sections definitely add. They add to the thing. You just sit there, and like I said, that change and Come, like you're sitting there, and it's just like you just kind of sit back and you just have to groove with them. Like it's, I love that song. It's a great one. That whole, I like the whole album. It isn't one of my favorites, but I do enjoy it.
Yeah, I know, like, on some of the other panels, they talked about using AI. Oh, excuse me. Using AI to kind of strip away the vocals to hear just the music. Ethics around that sometimes, but it really is a study to really be able to appreciate the layers that are happening there, because when you take off the lyrics, you can really hear of how things are arranged, and it's just like, wow, he's literally a genius, and he doesn't get enough anything for that. Okay, so next question. How does Come compare to Prince's other albums released in the 90s? And do you see it as a continuation, departure, or something entirely unique within his discography? And let's start with, I'll go back to you, Violet.
Now, to me, and I know I've said it before, but I do, when I'm listening to Prince, I think about who's in the band at the time and the energy that they bring together. And with Sonny T and Michael Bland, even though I know there are other people, there's horns and there's, of course, gorgeous Tommy Barbarella, and I know all of that stuff is there. But it like I said, I always feel like there's just more testosterone in the music that they made during that period. And I know that sounds crazy, but there's just a way that there's a ambulance, the energy that each musician brings to the instrument that they're playing, and then you bring all of that together with other musicians, it's a feeling. And I feel there's men in the room when I'm listening to them play. And I feel like all of those albums, like I said, Love Symbol is one of my favorite albums. Diamonds and Pearls is a great album, but if you listen to the way that they play together, it's totally different than, like, say, the Love Sexy Band, which is an amazing band. Definitely different than Revolution, which is amazing. But they're all amazing. But those 90s albums with that particular mix of musicians, to me, that's how I'll end that.
Okay. Aisha?
I kind of like break the 90s up pre 94 and then 94 onward, because there is, I think, when the person changes, the music changes, the person creating the music changes. So there is something that's a little bit lighter about him in the earlier part of the 90s, where he was still having a lot of fun with the creation. Then there's that bump in the road, and then there is him trying to figure out the rest of the 90s, and then life happens in these different periods in the late 90s, and having to readjust that. And so I think where the 80s, you get this kind of singular progression from one album to the next. The 90s is kind of like a potpourri that is based on what is going on in his life, the events in his life running parallel with the creation and the output of the music. And I also think too that, did he really have a whole lot to prove in the 90s, right? Like everything, his 80s catalog was really about him having to prove that he was worthy and of his success. And that's how we get to the point from the first album up to Purple Rain and on through. But the 90s, it was kind of like, okay, do I have anything to prove at this middle point? And then who am I having to prove this to? Maybe I'll just start to make music that satisfies me. And he kind of carried that. It was a transition. He had to figure it out, but he kind of carried it on with him through the rest of his career.
Okay. Chinisha?
And I hate to be this person, but I'm going to disagree with you just slightly, Aisha, because yes, I do think that he was discovering himself. Absolutely. And also, I think that the pushback against WB was about him being like, well, this is the sound that I want to make. I'm going to go do it. But I do think that there's a point of him who was also proving a point of like, this is the music that I want to make and this feels good to me and here's why. And in a lot of the, he'd get on stage and do the live shows and he'd go, real music by real musicians. And so I think there was like a real sonic shift from the 80s where the sound was like really the LM1, you've got the Akais, you've got the Oberheimers, it was like a reliant on some of that technology, and you can hear in the composition in the 90s how he moves away from that, especially by the time we get to like Crystal Ball and the Rainbow Children's, where it's like it's very much like jazz influenced. He moves into musicology and it becomes like I'm hearkening back to a sound that wasn't even really part of my career, even though the musicality was there, was never really like the core of my compositions. And I think that you can hear the evolution of him being like of his time, and then in the late 90s kind of like still doing that similar sound, but in a way that feels out of place. And then by the time you get to the early 2000s, he's doing kind of like music that's good, but it feels like R&B that doesn't quite meet the era that he's in, and also like live jazz and like big band music that also doesn't feel of its era, but it's just like musically important, right? So I wonder if I think that he kind of got stuck in the pushback and forth at some point of trying to prove a point, even though he was trying to prove that I have nothing to prove, if that makes any sense.
It does. Okay. Miss Rhonda?
For me, Come definitely marks a stop. It is a finishing piece that kind of ties up everything from 1978 to 1993. It definitely feels like I've done everything that I'm going to do with a particular sound, with a particular image, with a particular mindset. And I do remember feeling that way even back in 1994. Again, that might have also been helped by kind of understanding the narrative that he was pushing publicly at that time. But even now, listening to it, it's like, this is definitely a transition point. Like, this is it. And now we're moving into a whole new experience until I say we're not doing that anymore. I think that, again, musically, especially when I think about what he had done in the earlier 90s, kind of starting with Graffiti Bridge and moving, through everything that happened up to that point, there was a very clear delineation between those early 90s albums and then this one. And I think, again, because I was at that time still so very enamored with the Love Symbol album, I was kind of at first, I guess, maybe expecting there to be a little bit of a continuation of that fantasy, of that story, of that visual, of all of that kind of aesthetic. And so there's such a stark difference between that and Come. It absolutely represents the finality. It's like, this is it. We're moving on. Next. And of course, as we all talk about all the time, because Prince was doing all the things at once, you had 1-800-NEW-FUNK. You've got The Most Beautiful Girl in the World. We're starting to get inklings of what's going to happen with the Gold Experience. All of these things are happening at the same time in the early days of the internet. There's no social media, but there's still plenty of ways that we can kind of figure out what's happening. And, again, this has been brought up in some other conversations this weekend. There wasn't a lot of commotion for Come either. It's just like, here it is, bye. And we're moving on to the next thing. So it definitely feels like this album was a here, damn it, and F you. I'm leaving and doing something else.
Okay. Mila?
I looked at this album actually as like a continuation of what he was doing. And I guess also since I was like bopping around from different eras, but also different albums within the era. And to me, it seemed like all of the 90s, there was just this variation of, I guess, an overall theme of change, but it seemed more of him like speaking on like personally, I guess, just of what also was going on in his life at the time. To me, I saw like the 80s as like, I mean, that was most of his 20s. So that was just like the grind era. It was just like, here's what I got, here's what I can do type of thing. And to me, it seemed like once he got into his 30s, it's like, he's been in the game for a while. And then his music is just steadily getting more like personal. And there's variations of that, I guess, throughout the decade, but it all just seemed like a continuation of us watching him explore of like, all right, where am I at spiritually? Okay, this is where I'm going. Where am I at in my career? Okay, this is where I'm going, and kind of like just taking us all by the hand and like walking us through his journey with him. So I guess I'd say that, yeah, it's like a continuation of what that decade was coming off to me.
Okay. So, as you guys know, whenever I kind of do my muse things, I always want to get a little bit deeper about how people connect to Prince personally and to his music. So, these next couple of questions are on that. So, broadly, how does Come connect to you personally? Do any of its themes resonate with your own experiences and perspectives? So, we'll start with Ms. Rhonda.
In 1994, not at all. Well, very little. Just where I was in my personal evolution timeline, I liked it, I dug it, but it wasn't an album that I listened to where I felt that I found myself in it, with maybe the exception of Solo. Because again, as I said earlier, I kind of understood the isolation and that feeling of, what the Fness is happening in my life right now. But I've grown into the album, and I think one of the brilliant things about Prince, both as an artist and the benefit, the privilege of being able to just ride with him for a number of years, is that something that did not necessarily speak to you when it was initially released can become something that really resonates with you later. So from a personal perspective, Come is definitely not one of the albums that I point to and say, this is an album where I've discovered myself. This is an album where I've been able to ask some different questions of myself earlier in life. But not unlike the song Don't Play Me, now that I'm much older, I'm like, oh, I get this. Like, I understand the anger and the frustration that he's expressing. I understand a song like Let It Go, where he's like, you know what? I'm not even fooling with y'all. Like, you're playing in my face and I'm not doing this anymore. I'm freeing myself from that. I don't have to do this the way that I've been doing it. I understand the sort of urgency of a song like Come that may not have the same level of romanticism or sensuality that some of his other, more sexually oriented type music has, but that there's also a different conversation that's happening. And, definitely like with a song like Space, that song I definitely felt back then for sure, because it felt kind of like it fed my inner hippie in an interesting way. So I kind of felt like that song, we could just be outside doing this and playing in grass and chasing butterflies and such. But overall, as an album, it took a while for that album to really sit with me the way some of his other work has sat with me more immediately.
Okay. Chinisha?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, this, like I said, this is one of my favorite Prince albums, just because it just feels like such a cohesive piece of work. I was when I was discovering Prince, I knew of Prince. Prince was always in my home, but when I started collecting the albums, I didn't have Spotify or the whatever, so I had to like go out and find the albums, and I was paying for them and buying them on my own when I was in high school, and so I was doing my best to get them in order so that I can kind of like experience the experience, but I was also doing it in this really like truncated period of time. So I was like bopping from album to album. So like by the time I got to Come became part of my rotation very, very quickly because of where I was. I'd finishing high school, and then it became like the soundtrack throughout most of college for me. And I just really felt like I was becoming an adult at the time that I was listening to this album. And so much of this was me also doing the same kinds of self-reflection. And, not to get too deep into like my personal life at that time, but so much of the album's kind of like overtures resonated for me. So I felt like I was feeling them much more deeply than I might have if I were discovering it for the first time now, or had been 10 or 15 years prior to that. So, for me, it's because and I think that a lot of folks have this experience where it's just like the nostalgia of learning and discovering something makes it a loved album. And I think that's where this one falls for me, where like musically, I love all of Prince's work, but there's something like theme wise, like lyrically about this album that just felt that resonated in ways that some of the other albums may not have.
Okay. How about you, Mila?
When I first listened to the album, similar to what's been brought up on the panel, but it took me a minute. So I think I mentioned earlier that like it felt like an album that was challenging me because I hadn't ever listened to an album like that before. One of the first thoughts I walked away with was just like, oh, this man's an artist, because I'd never experienced that level of high quality before in an album. But thinking about it, I was in high school, and when I listened to this album, it was coinciding with some of the things that I was seeing on Tumblr, in particular when it came to sex. Like the first 3 songs of that album, I know it sounds dramatic to feel like it changed my life, but it did. Because I had just never heard a song, like songs that were coming from that perspective, I guess. Like that was some of the first like non male centered, at least for Come. Pheromone is it's pheromone. But for Come in Space, like those two for me, because I mean, this is also a time when I've heard everything from Ying Yang Twins to Train Up. Like it was like I've heard stuff like that, but then even with something like Come, I was just like, what? Like, so at the time when I was trying to understand this world of, sex in high school, 'cause everyone else is talking about it, but I'm just in my lone bubble as like a really shy kid, and I'm just like, all right, I know he talks about this stuff, so let's use Prince to like kind of dive into it and see what this thing is about. So that's why Come, even though it's not, I don't know, it might be in my top 5. It changes, but it's up there, but it's not like my number 1 or my number 2, but it's always still like this, like, I don't know how to describe it. The album that I always just like keep with me. If it's like, oh yeah, I remember those little memories with you. Discovering this topic as a young teenager now, it does resonate with me differently as I'm getting into my career, feeling some of these things that he was feeling of, you can't tell me what to do. I think you're doing it wrong. Just all this stuff. So it resonates with me, I guess, almost in the way that it was intended for. Now that I'm getting older, initially though, it was something way different than what I guess his intention was for the album.
Okay. Aisha?
Like Prince had that seizure disorder as a child. I developed one as an adult, a late adult. And so I have Swiss cheese memories when it comes to certain things, and I think 1994 might be one of those things that I just cannot remember. But I do recall the second time I bought the cassette, in which I'm actually looking at it right now. It's on my fireplace mantle. I bought it in 1990. Early 99, because I happened to see it on sale at a store that was closing. And I was in thesis panic mode. I was in graduate school. I had 5 months to finish my master's thesis. And I would play that cassette over and over and over again while I was working. And I remember not paying attention. And I did that a lot with Prince music when I was working. It's like the music was just there for background. And then I stopped for some reason because the words to come, I caught my ear and I'm like, wait, how did I miss that? I don't remember that. Or why is this like affecting me like now? And I realized, am I getting older that I'm just kind of like shocked at something that Prince said? But that connection, just that period of that writing that thesis is why I keep that cassette sitting up there to remind me of that accomplishment, because I got it done under time. So, and it was with the help of that cassette.
That's great. Okay. Miss Violet?
Now it's taking me a second to get to the mute button. Okay, so for me, it is like I said this before, it is not one of my favorite albums. I do listen to it. I tend to group things in my mind. I think about, because I teach, I think about the way the mind works all the time. And I think of like definitely the Vault and Exodus album and Crystal Ball, like I think of them all kind of as a group. So when you hear me say that they have a similar sound, that's what I'm thinking is there's a similar theme throughout all of that music. And I really do tend to listen to this album when I'm in a certain mood and it's specific songs that I'm going to listen to it. It's great. It's just not one of my top. When I got to start buying my own stuff, it was more that musicology era stuff. So that's where I tend to have a whole bunch of real deep personal thoughts. But for 90s music, it's basically my dad's music, who I love. And I listened to it because of him. I remember Let It Go being a big deal with my dad. I remember that. Now I have all like the maxi single with the Shermstick version. That I think that's probably my favorite one, because the psychedelic kind of, I dig that. But yeah, that's it for me. It's a great album. Everybody should listen to it. It's just not in my top, definitely not in my top 5. Like if I had a top 20. And I also agree, somebody said this, it changes because I am a Gemini and it's a mood thing. And so today I'm saying is not in the top 20.
Man, if I wasn't my own panelist, I'd probably say too much of my business. So we're going to go to the next question of why I'm not talking about why I relate to this. Okay. How does this album reflect to Prince's portrayal of women in his music? And what is your take on the gender dynamics within the lyrics and the themes? We'll start with Chinisha.
It's a great question. I think that for me, this is one of the albums that he's taking a less explicit stance on like making characterizations around gender, whether it's male or female or some other kind of like androgynous kind of middle character. There's no Camille, there's no, and even his. It's a really human album, I feel like, and I don't think that it's calling out like this is how you be a man. Even with the masculine and feminine aspects and like the masculinity that we talked about earlier about in the sound of it, I still think that like the lyricism of it or the way that it's intending to portray femininity, whether it is at all, is a lot less explicit. I will say though, the track, not even a song, just the orgasm at the end is a really interesting interpretation of femininity. And it's definitely like, I think from his own, whether a fantasy experience or an experience that he actually had, it's curious listening to him like, this is what an orgasm sounds like to me when I'm doing it. And I'm like, good for you. So I think it is, typically it is a Prince thinking about what womanhood looks like through his own eyes. But I think that in comparison to a lot of his other albums, I think he does a lot less of it here, and I couldn't characterize why, but I think it's less present than it is in most of his other albums, which is curious. Even with his collaborators, there's just fewer women collaborators in his universe right now, intentionally with the Wendy and Lisa fallout, or unintentionally because of like some subconscious effort to masculinize his world. I don't know, but it feels like there's less of a female presence altogether on this album.
Okay, Rhonda?
I keep thinking about the masculinity of this album, and it's like Prince put a sign on the door, like "No girls allowed, stupid girls." Anyway, interestingly, I think that this is one of the few albums where there's a very clear expression of anger towards a woman, and I'm just from my own interpretation of a song like "Dark." Because in so many of his other songs, even when there's that tension and that conflict, he really seems to try to almost put it like, I mean, it's probably me. Like, whatever happened, I just want to get you back. I just want to make it right. And this is a song where he's very explicitly like, yo, you hurt me. You broke my heart. I'm mad as hell. I kind of hate you a little bit. I mean, yes, we have I Hate You as well. But again, on this album, I feel like this is the first time, at least in my experience with Prince, that it's very obvious that he's mad at somebody. And I think that just kind of is the vibe of the album anyway, that there's a lot of anger and frustration and there's this heaviness and he's dealing with all of that. As far as his characterization of the feminine or women and so forth on the album, it definitely is not as pronounced as it has been on previous albums. But you also, again, have his engagement with the whole idea of consent and creating safe space. So, we've got a song like Come where he's got this crazy line. I'm not going to repeat it again. And it's like, what? But you understand that this is a very important conversation to have with a partner, whether this is a long-term partner or just somebody you just met 5 minutes ago and you're about to, get it popping. So he's got this very clear understanding of still creating that safe space, regardless as to the time that's going to be occupied in that space. And then I think, again, Orgasm is not a track that I listen to often. When the album first came out, I certainly listened to it more because one, I was trying to figure out, are they really doing something? And that was before I knew that it was, a sample from another song and that it was Denise and all of that. And then, so there was kind of are they really doing something? Who is that? Because the liner notes just say she knows. And then I was just like, I don't need to listen to that. There's nothing here for me in that song. But it is interesting to listen to it because I think it also harkens to a less mature version of what he understands womanhood to be. And so I think by that time in his real lived experience, he probably knows that women don't necessarily always make those kinds of sounds. But I also think that the song is not supposed to just simply be about a sexual release, but just kind of the release of all the things that he's telling us we're letting go. So I think that his relationship to women and to femininity in this album is a little bit more obscure, but it's still there. I mean, there's still definitely hints of his level of consideration and thought that goes into his interactions with women and with femininity in general.
Okay. Aisha?
Jill Jones says to me all the time, Prince had a Madonna whore complex. And I actually wrote this in an article that I wrote a couple years ago called Prince, the Profane and the Profound. And this album is kind of like that. From you kind of get that in terms of how he explores gender. The other thing I get from between what Rhonda and Chinisha said is this element of kind of being gaslit as a woman in some ways, where at the beginning it's kind of like a seduction, then the thing that my mother calls to shake your hand with one hand and slap you in the face with the other with dark. And then the orgasm, well, to make it all better, I'm just going to make you feel what I think you want to feel. And I think this is representative of that. And it's so unlike other albums where he explores issues of gender and treatment of women. But I think too, it also goes back to what he was dealing with sometimes. You hurt the people you love, and hurt people hurt people. And oftentimes when men are hurting, their targets of their pain are women. And that's what I get from that.
Okay. Mila, what do you think?
I totally agree with what you just said, Aisha, because I think that's one of those things of why, like, I couldn't put it to words when I first heard it, but that's why I was walking away from the album also feeling conflicted, because the album, it does start on like such a high, I guess, like in regards to like his relationship like with women or so, or how he's portraying women in his album. I mean, I guess sort of even like how he says in, what is it? Is it Solo? Where he says like so low, so high. Like it kind of felt like this, like, what are we doing here? Because it started like that and it trails after a while, it just feels like women are like an afterthought, which is like, okay, taking, I guess, into context of where he was coming from of making this, it's just like, yeah, I guess he's just trying to stick it to Warner. So it's not really like much of a forefront thought of how to portray women either properly in the songs or nicely. Because even when I think of, I listened to Come, and then when I watched the Beautiful Experience, which obviously is like an intermix of the other songs like ended up on the other albums, but I left feeling confused a little bit of what he wanted us as women to take away from that. I think when I was younger, and I watched it the first time, it was just like, oh, he wants us to feel liberated. And then I got older and I'm like, like, is that what you think, Prince? I don't know. Like there were just some moments, I guess, of how he had Nona Gay's character kind of like acting like, or I guess interacting like with the computer and all that stuff. And I'm like, I don't know. I think ultimately that's where I chalked it up to of like, I don't know. The dance is great, but I I guess I kind of left ultimately of like women, I guess, were kind of like more of an afterthought for this album. So I didn't really, I think that's why it starts getting a lower ranking for me of his albums, just because of that aspect. This is how I took it.
That's fair. That's a good point about the Beautiful Experience. I'm like, when I remember first seeing it, I'm like, oh, this is my regular Friday. I get a pizza, I get on the computer and look up a bunch of Prince stuff. But that's a really great point because she feels like almost like a child in the way she's portrayed there, and she's like, oh, I'm gonna rock under my desk. I'm like, but you're Nona Gay. Like, I mean, my whole situation here is because it's. I wanted her to feel more empowered, but Violet, go ahead.
I think everybody's right on it with this. We talked about this earlier. You bring energy with you, right? As a musician, as an artist, and we know that he's having the whole fight with Warner's. We know, like I did post it, that slave trade, a clip from that film where he's wanting to have control over his work, and Michael Bland talks about him basically taking his anger out in the music. And one of the ladies said it earlier about release, and I think that that's kind of how the women are used here. And I love Prince. I'm not saying anything negative about him. I feel like the focus is different. So a lot of times when he's writing, it feels like he's talking to us and he's saying things the way we want to hear it and all that. And with this one, it's kind of like, I'm pissed and I need to get something out, and I like women and there's a girl. So that's kind of the way that it comes off to me. It's just a different, and sometimes that's how you feel. Like, you know what I mean? I'm not saying anything bad about him. It just, the headspace that he seemed to be in gave us a different kind of product. And it probably is the reason that I don't, like I said, even for me, I only listen to it at certain times. And this is a person who can make you feel all the things, right? I always feel a little bit more just on the angry side. And you think about it, in some of the songs, I'm thinking about like Pheromone, women being tied up, running for the door. There's elements like that throughout. I'm gonna tell you how to feel. Excuse me, like, you know what I mean? There's a lot of very, I'm a man, and it may even be because he was having that issue where this is stuff that he created, and Warner's is saying you don't have control. Well, this is something I can control, doggone it, and so this is what I'm going to do. But that, I don't know, it's just a different. Yes, women are present, not in the same way, because he usually gives more of a put the woman on a pedestal. She's right out front. I'm going to be soft and gentle with you kind of thing, and this is not that. It just is not that. And that's not necessarily bad, it's just different.
Yeah, I mean, as you guys are talking, and not time to go down this thread, but maybe in this instance, women aren't necessarily women here. They are a metaphor for how he's seeing his career or how he wants to control his career instead. So something to think about. And I wanted to call out Ms. Camila's comment. She says, I think we have to be aware of not stripping men of their right to explore the full range of their emotions and humanity, including their emotions. Prince should have the space to express honest feelings about being hurt by a woman on a song like Dark without being deemed a misogynist. And that's fair. It really is, especially when you're thinking about even solo and these days where they're like, well, men are not allowed to say their emotions, it makes them simps or whatever else. Prince has always been someone who documented the human experience and through his music. And I think Come especially is him doing that in a way that's a little more intimate than usual for outside of sex, outside of love. But here's how we feel with anxiety, with depression, with all of it, right?
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment on that real quick. I guess because Pheromone is, I guess, one of those songs where it's musically amazing. The lyrics, I think as I was getting older, it was starting to give like 50 Shades of Grey, where like literally, like, yeah, sure, the things that he's breaking down, but the commotion that was happening around 50 Shades of Grey when it came out, a lot of people were like, this isn't an actual like accurate portrayal of this world. They're actually portraying it a bit abusive. Like there was kind of this conversation of like, is this an actual portrayal of like the BDSM world type of thing? And it's like, you don't want to yuck someone's yum. It's like, if that is what they're into, that's what they're into. You can't say it's wrong. I think it was giving that just because I can't really say exactly why, but it just made me think of that. I guess hearing Violet's comments, I'm like, yeah, it was giving, how are you doing? Is this ethical? Does she consent? Like, I think so, but like, I think that because it's a new space issue, he was kind of contributing, exploring in his music. It was just sort of hard to gauge of like, where exactly are you at with this?
I mean, I'm sorry because we're going down the rabbit hole. Mila, you're absolutely right. And then someone just dropped the extra lovable reference in the chat, and I like, there's a point in extra lovable where I'm like, I love it. I gotta turn it off because I like, there's a line at the very end, if we know what the one I'm talking about, where it's just like, bruh, that's not what we do. You like very explicitly not doing that. And so I do think there's a question of consent when, explicitly, there's none of the released stuff he's ever done anything like that. But we do want to talk about like, and someone also brought up sister in the chat. I've been like trying to keep my eye on in the chat while we're talking about this. I do think that he is always conflicted about like, his participation in sex and like wanting to be a participant, and whether he had as much sex as he alluded to, or if it was explicit as he alluded to. I think there's like this universe of sex that he's a participant in, and I think that consent has to be like at the fore of his mind because it has played a role in his life in various ways. And so it's interesting thinking about that, like, yeah, bruh, like whether, yeah, I'm participating in this act too. Do I get a say? Even in like the orgasm of it all, it's like, yeah, that's what you think, but also performance time. Like, I don't just the who's all involved here.
But also agency of the woman, that some people do experience sexuality that way. And even with pheromone, because I wrote an article for Erica Thompson's blog about some of those themes, BDSM, especially across Prince's music. And it's a whole lifestyle. Consent is absolutely a thing, but it's also a way to, again, explore those insecurities in physical ways and erotic ways. So I still feel like it jives with the theme of cum, but again, a whole paper worth of information there. We have 8 minutes left, and I do see a question in the Q&A from Ms. Camila. She says, to the panel, how did your engagement with Prince as a male artist and his exploration of love and sex compare to that of the music of other male artists at that time?
Can I just speak out and say it can't be compared? That's what I will say about that. And that's all I have to say. Can't even be compared. And I can think of artists I love, but because I was a child when I learned about him, there were, I'm gonna say I'm almost being like KaNisa and telling too much, except for I'm a panelist, and I'm not gonna do it. I will just say that I learned a lot about life and sex, and that songs can make you feel things, and I learned a lot of that through listening to his music. And I can't really say that there are many artists that I would be able to say the same about.
I was thinking about what we were listening to in 93, 94 outside of Prince. And absolutely, I hear his influence in Jodeci in that time, Fiendin' with, what is that? I'll Cry For You, Die For You, whatever that song was. They had a couple of songs around that era where it was very evocative of Adore and International Lover and some of his ballads. Thematically, how they treated their ways of talking to women in those songs, I think also is a little bit reflective of that. So you definitely hear the influence in some of that current R&B that was happening in that time. So I think, definitely, and again, the years might not necessarily be correct, but just, we had Maxwell happening in that general vicinity of the 90s. It's All a Blur, Eric Benet. So you had a lot of artists immediately in the 93, 94 time space, and then 95, 96, et cetera, where you're definitely hearing the influence of Prince's earlier work, for sure, in how they are presenting the music, the instrumentation, the arrangement, as well as their vocal performance and the lyrical content, and how they are approaching their romantic prospects through those songs.
I also think that there is a bit of a difference in like male cis hetero representations of sex and sexuality that are coming from a lot of those bigger artists, and like an agreement that men in music would have about how we're going to talk about romance in a way. And I think Prince, even where he maybe doesn't always like get it 100% right, is also exploring perspectives in sex and sexuality. So he's looking at what it looks like to be from a woman's perspective, with the limitations of who he is as a human, and that's what all of us do, right? But I think that his music is having an exploration and trying to find an empathy that you don't necessarily see from a lot of those other contemporaries. I think for me, listening to his music, while complicated and not always perfect, has always felt welcoming, or like creating a space, which is what we always talk about with these like ladies roundtables, about the way women find their spaces in the conversation. So I thought that for me, that was interesting coming up, where it didn't always feel perfect, but it felt like there was room for me to listen to him in a way.
I think about it a little bit differently, kind of going back to the era of music that he grew up in with the men of the 70s and men that we tend to think about as being romantic and virile, like Teddy Pendergrass and Al Green. And my daughter brought something to my attention listening to Soul Town on Sirius XM. If you ever do, listen to Al Green lyrics and listen to Teddy Pendergrass lyrics. There's a Teddy Pendergrass song we heard where it's like, it basically is like, you're ugly and you're lucky I'm talking to you. And it's kind of like, well, there was that element of it. And here you have him just kind of impersonating it in all its form on this album. Same thing with Al Green. He's got a song called Look What You Done to Me. And I get that from those lyrics, I get what Prince is saying in Dark.
Yeah, that kind of makes me think of, I guess, like in general, sometimes when engaging with these songs and music focusing on love and sex from men, it's like you're always going into it very cautiously. It's like, what am I? Are we on the same page? Type of thing. That's what I guess your comment made me think of, Aisha.
I see Miss D'Angela coming on stage with us. So I'm just going to say thank you guys for being here with us today. We didn't even get through all my questions, but it was a pleasure to moderate you all. And I'll hand it back over to Miss D'Angela.